Thanks so much, Laura, for sharing your garden with us. And right now we're going to be talking about trees, summer tips for survival, and how to diagnose problems or prevent problems from ever happening to your trees. I'm joined by Guy LeBlanc, who's an arborist with Arbor Vitae Tree Care, and it's a great pleasure to have you back on Central Texas Garden. It's been a while.
Yes, it's been a long time. Thanks, Tom.
It's a pleasure to have you here, Guy. And, thinking about tree care, so many people, wait until a problem exists. But carefully planting trees and carefully maintaining them really prevents so many of the common mistakes. And so that's what we're going to try to do today, is kind of walk people through proper planting of trees. And let's start right there.
Okay.
What are the most common mistakes that you see that come from when people are planting a tree?
Well, I think it really starts with site selection. We have a saying, right tree in the right place, and it's one of the most common things overlooked by people. A very obvious consideration is overhead power lines. We need to be careful when we're planting large shade trees that we're not planting them directly under power lines. But likewise, many communities now and neighborhoods have underground utilities, so we need to be especially careful, especially for our own safety, about the possible existence of underground utilities.
Right.
We also need to consider such things as property lines. You don't want to be encroaching on a neighbor too much with a very large shade tree.
Right.
And then finally, the function that the tree is going to serve for us as well has a great deal to do with where we're going to place the tree.
Yeah, so, and this is one thing I try to get people to think about. And increasingly, people are finding that yards are downsized. And a lot of people, that's a preference. They don't want a giant yard to take care of. But choosing a tree for a very small yard, a tight space, is very different from one with an expansive front yard, for example.
It is a very difficult for species selection there. Oftentimes nowadays these buildings that are on smaller lots are very, very large, and so the building itself is casting an incredible shadow. So we need to consider not just the mature size of the tree, but also what its light needs are. Most large shade trees are going to want lots of light for most of the day,
Right.
so we're probably going to need to choose not only smaller species in that situation, but species that are a little bit more shade tolerant.
Now, one thing, I think this is an area that we haven't explored a whole lot in Central Texas Gardener in the past, and I think it would be real interesting for people to hear, is when you go in a nursery and you say, I want a shade tree, or whatever kind of tree you might be looking for, they take you to the spot, and there are 30 of the same tree.
Right.
How can you just visually go through those trees and determine, hey, this one looks more healthy, this one looks more vigorous than the rest? What are the tips that people need to be looking for?
Well, that gets us into the second part of your plan for getting off on a right start, and that's with your specimen selection. And there are several key things I like to look at. Since I like to recommend to folks to plant smaller trees rather than go for the instant shade, because a smaller tree will adapt better to the site. And the good news about that, it's beneficial or advantageous in many ways, but one of the ways is that a smaller tree, we don't have to worry too much about many of the above ground defects that the tree might have in terms of structure, because many of those branches ultimately aren't going to be on the tree.
Sure.
But we do want to look for the foliage color and foliage quantity and foliage size. These are indicators of general plant health. I tend to recommend, especially for large shade trees, that we want single trunk trees. Most of the other above ground defects, again, we can deal with over time. But most importantly, people really need to look underground. One of the biggest problems that we see time and time again with relatively young trees is the girdling roots. And this is where roots inside of the pot that the tree is grown in have begun to swirl around the inside of that container, and they've become hardened in that state. So if the plant is removed from the ground, put in the ground in that state, those roots are going to continue to grow in that circular manner. They're not going to distribute to the soil, give the plant the stability and the nutrient and water uptake it needs, and typically within 10 years it's going to die.
Yeah, and I've heard time and time again on the radio people describing trees that they put in the ground and look perfectly healthy. They died unexpectedly and rather quickly, and this often is the case.
Yes.
The roots are girdled. So let's, again, thinking some tips for folks. I don't think it's uncalled for to, when you're looking at plants in the nursery and they seem full for the pot size, maybe exploring the look of the roots.
I always recommend it, and I've always done it personally when purchasing trees for myself and for clients. With a larger tree, that gets tougher to do, and if the tree has roots coming out of the bottom of the pot, it's going to make it very tough. It's a tip-off that you're very likely to have girdling roots, but it's also going to make it pretty hard to get it out of the pot.
Yeah. Well, and you know, if you go to pick up the plant in the nursery and it's growing into the ground, that may not be the one you want.
Exactly. You might want to pass on that one. And other things to look for is damage to the trunk. Also, a tree that cannot stand on its own. They're typically bound up or surrounded by many other trees. If you pull it aside and it can't stand up on its own, that certainly isn't a plant you're going to want, because we would prefer to avoid staking, and we can talk about staking also.
Well, and let's do that. I mean,
Okay.
I mean, this is a common question that people have. They bring a young tree home, they set it out, they think, I've seen young trees staked, so they do it, kind of automatic reflex. But really, that's not an ideal.
It really isn't. Actually, industry standards call for not staking trees unless necessary. And in my opinion, unless necessary would mean that perhaps you've chosen the wrong plant, or the wrong plant's been given to you. If you have an extremely windy site or an particularly dense crowned tree with very wet soils that might be a bit more prone to being blown over, you might want to stake in that situation. I would recommend the stakes stay on for no more than a year, and you have to pay close attention to whether or not the webbing material that you attach to the stakes is not going to gouge into the trunk or branches.
Okay.
But ideally, you really prefer to have a tree that is not staked.
So again, look for a good specimen that's going to stand on its own, and let it stand on its own.
Absolutely.
Now, planting itself, people make a lot of mistakes in terms of planting depth. This is another big issue that I have to diagnose often on the radio. People plant typically too deep on the trees. What's your recommendation?
I agree. That's probably one of the most common mistakes made. And again, standard industry recommendation is to plant that tree so that the root flare is exactly at the level of the ground. The root flare is where the very base of the trunk starts to widen laterally into the roots. Now, sometimes that's hidden because in the nursery, either dirt has accumulated or it was actually planted too deep when it was repotted at a nursery. So if you don't see that root flare at the base when it's in the nursery, it might be a tip to avoid that plant as well.
Yeah, and generally I'm beginning to tell people, you know, the soil level in the pot should be about an inch above the soil level around. It's a good way to just avoid that problem if you can.
Yes, because you may get some settling, which would then put the plant too deeply. So planting a little bit high, as you suggest, about an inch, would be preferable to too deep.
Yeah.
I ideally like to recommend that we be right at grade, provided that we do have a good firm base under the plant that's not going to settle.
Okay, great. Now, summer survival tips. Say somebody has put a new tree in the ground. If you want to avoid problems, what are the most important things people need to be thinking about right now?
Well, the best thing to do is to plant in the fall, so that by the time summer comes around, that tree has as much of a root system as it can going into the summer season. Planting now, your tree is going to be much more likely to be drought susceptible. So summer survival tips would boil down to water, water, water.
Yeah.
But if you are adding proper soil amendments, top dressing with proper soil amendments, these are going to give you good moisture retention in your soil, and that can also be beneficial.
Yeah, so, you know, basically, when you say water, 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 what I tell people is, you know, initially when the plant goes in the ground, remember it's been watered every day, so several times a week at least.
Yes.
But the ideal is to get it to one good deep watering a week. Would you say that it would be accurate?
Yes, but I think that if a tree was planted, say about recently, it's going to need much more than that to get through that first summer. I would think 3 times a week minimum. Depending on the drainage of the soil, it might need even more frequency than that.
All right. Well, Guy, these have been great tips for people who are out hunting for trees or wanting to take care of young ones. We really appreciate you coming back on the program.
Thank you.
Again, Guy LeBlanc from Arbor Vitae Tree Care here in Austin. It's been a pleasure visiting with you again.
Thanks, Tom.
And coming up next, it's Skip Richter.